Bernard-Henri Lévy, thank you for joining us on I24 News.
Thank you.
The title of your new documentary is itself the obvious question to ask. Pourquoi Ukraine? Why Ukraine? Why did you go to Ukraine? And what is the message you bring out of it for the rest of us?
Why did I go in Ukraine? Because I understood very soon that the stake of Europe was playing there. Because at the beginning of the war, I was absolutely devastated by the extent of the savagery, the extent of the crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, because it was the return of carnage in Europe. And my role as an intellectual, I felt that it was to be there.
Right. Now, tell us what you found there. I mean, what the impression it made on you, what you came out of, and maybe what you learned there from being on the ground.
What I learned first is what I just told you, and what I learned also, which I knew but which I checked, was the courage, the greatness of the Ukrainian people. The fact, you know that in Israel, of course, and I know it, but the fact that in Europe you can have a nation fighting for herself and for universal values with such a bravery, this was heartwarming for me. And I decided to film that, the courage of the resistance, the ladies and the gentlemen in the trenches risking their life every day to protect something which is greater than themselves. This is what I saw and what I witnessed.
Now, in some of your other activities, your missions, you've had to convince the Western world that they have much at stake in conflicts, be it in Libya or in Bosnia, and you had to make that case. Here, it's a little different. I think the West understood right from the beginning they have much at stake in Ukraine, but it's a question of how much can they go to help without provoking a broader conflict. Could they even involve themselves militarily?
They understood because they had no choice.
Right.
Putin told them. In this case, Putin really conceived this war from the very start as a war targeting much beyond Ukraine.
Sure.
The rest of the world, the rest of Europe, which he hates, which he has the project of destabilizing Europe. The poor countries which are, he creates hunger like in the time of Holodomor in the 30s. So the world is implicated by the will of Putin. So we had no choice. The West had no choice. Now the question, which I think is still unsolved, is will the effort of the West continue or not? Will all the democracies, including Israel, will understood that there is a brotherhood, necessary brotherhood, between them and Ukraine, that it is the same front line and the same fight? And will we continue thinking that in the long time if necessary? Because there is a law in democracies which we well know, all of us, since Alexis de Tocqueville. Democracies, there is a versatility, opinion change. They make a focus and then they make the defocus. So this is a challenge, to continue to be as consistent, persistent as Putin, alas, is. This is what I want to contribute to achieve by showing this movie.
Now, you mentioned Israel, who has a sort of dilemma with Ukraine that is even more sharply focused on some of the other Western democracies. Ukraine has asked Israel for military help. Israel's given it aid, but not military help because of its interest with Russia in Syria, the Jewish community in both Ukraine and Russia. You're a defender of Israel, certainly, over the years, very much so. But what do you say to Israel, or the role of Israel vis-a-vis Ukraine?
I think that the place of Israel is at the side of Ukraine. I think that it is the same values. I think I know. I filmed so many Ukrainian soldiers or volunteers saying that their model was Israel. I heard so often on the front lines that the model of military and civil heroism for Ukrainians was Israel. There is such an admiration in Ukraine for Israel values, today Jewish values, Tzahal, purity of weapons and so on, that it would be heartbreaking, it would be sad that Israel would reply in a too smooth way to this declaration of brotherhood.
Right. Prime Minister Yair Lapid today is in Paris. He's meeting the French President Emmanuel Macron, a leader you've expressed some support of. Of course, they have other subjects they're dealing with, primarily Iran, Hezbollah, but certainly I guess Ukraine will be part of that agenda. I mean, what do you have to say about this meeting today in Paris?
We know what are the topics, of course. Hezbollah, Iran, and the gas. But behind the three topics, you have the shadow and the ghost of the Ukrainian war. Today, Iran is allied to Putin. You have a link between, maybe not, it will not last, but for the moment, you have an axis between Tehran, Turkey, China, Russia, and even some Islamist forces. When I see the Chechen fighters committing these savage acts under the scream of Allah Akbar and so on, I cannot prevent...
It's all connected. There's a thread you see running here.
Today, there is Western values in which I include, of course, Israel, and in front of that you have this axis of revenge countries who want to take their revenge against the West and so on. And under the three topics which Prime Minister Lapid is speaking today with President Macron, you have the shadow of this Ukrainian war. Why the question of the gas is so important? Because there is a world shortage of gas, and Hezbollah takes advantage by throwing some missiles. Why do this question of Iran is more hot than ever? Because there is an attempt for Iran to take advantage of this focus on Ukraine to steal, to push its advantage. So all of that is connected, of course. And I'm very happy of this trip today, that Prime Minister Lapid is in his first trip as a Prime Minister is in France. This is great. I'm sure that France can play a real role on the question of Lebanon, helping Lebanon to take its responsibilities in what is happening in the last hours. President Macron can have a real leverage on that. And I'm happy to see my fatherland, France, and my fatherland of heart, Israel, shaking hands, showing brotherhood to the world at this minute, and having common interest. This is great news for all of us, and for me in particular.
Bernard-Henri Lévy, the new film is Pourquoi Ukraine? Why Ukraine? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
On i24 News.